Good morning, guys. Today we are discussing on the Spring microservices. Spring microservices. Let's go to the Spring microservices first. So, what is Spring microservices? Spring has come with a framework which where we can write self-contained services APIs, which are REST APIs, and which give an output from the JSON format, and they are self-contained, and they can be deployed as an independent unit. They can have communicate and live in the ecosystem with others. So you can have an actuators and you can have historics around them to make sure the microservices, one microservices go down, it doesn't basically brings the entire ecosystem down. So they're very self-contained, and you can have historics which can take care of them, with the throttling and other things. So we now the focus is on the Spring framework. So we have a Spring Reactive, a Spring Flux framework. We have a Reactor core for the reactive streams, and then we have a Reactor Netty, right? Things by default, if you know that underneath of the Spring, when the Spring Boot starts, it still has a web server, which is an embedded one. It is a Netty or Tomcat, right? Toe, right? It has a default. So when you start that, it is using this to publish. It does not need to have a servlet container, which is what the Spring Classic had it, right? So we don't need to write the web.xml file to bring the servlet and the dispatcher, and then have a listener which will bring the REST APIs. Okay. So then we have a Spring Boot and Spring Boot starter for the Spring Boot. Let's go how this about the architecture. How does the reactive things has been solved with the Spring? Spring could have created a separate repository for reactive, but they decided to make sure for the Spring framework developers it is a minimal effort, minimal changes. They can still use the components and the building blocks of the Spring onto that. So if you look at Spring has a project reactor, and if you see, there is a servlet stack, right? For people who are using the web framework, they need a servlet stack here, and in parallel we have a asynchronous IO, which is a reactive stack, right? And then we have a servlet container, and we have a non-blocking or NIO runtime, right? So by default, Netty is a example of NIO runtime, and that's why embedded Netty is being used underground to do the reactive framework on this. Then we have a Spring Security. We have this parallel with the Spring Security Reactive. We have Spring MVC. We have Spring Web Flux, right? And underneath the components, we have the JDBC, DO, they are all same, except now the same components return a basically reactive output. So we in the reactive thing, we need to return uh, mono or web flux. Basically, we need to return the reactive streams, and that is depicted with a marble diagram. Okay, so APIs are same, but the return is now mono or flux. Okay, and they can be detective, and they are strings. So let's go to this one, and we'll more interested in code. So just this is a high level. So what is a mono and flux? Mono is for singleton, so basically for single. So if I have a one object, I want to return a mono stream, and the mono is empty. So, or you can return a empty mono. So here I'm creating a mono of string, all right? And in the next, if I have multiple items like a array list, or so let's say array list of string, a hello world or something, then I'm going to create a flux.just just is a reactive constructor pattern to return the flux stream. So I got a flux stream here, or I can create a flux from array, right? This is array. So flux has multiple things you can create from array list, or from the literals flux, or you can do that. So let's go to this one, the diagram. How does the response on the reactive thing comes? Again, this is Spring Reactive Framework. That way we are looking into that. So we have Spring Streamline Reactive Platform. We have a HTTP server. There is a server adapter, and then there is a stream that is being created. That's a flux here, you see, and it goes to the Spring Flux, right? And in everything you can use on next, right? On next. So, and then it goes to controller, and then it goes to data repository. And in our code, we will see how we write the Spring controllers which are reactive, and the data repository in this way. So for this one, I have a running a database. I'm using a basically a NoSQL database which returns me asynchronous thing, and I have a repo this one. So I'm using a MongoDB here, right? Let's go to our MongoDB here. So this is our MongoDB running out here. You see the MongoDB. So this is my MongoDB running this one thing. And you look at this is Mongo OS Access 432 Save Data STB. I started MongoDB and I'm also converted to SQL. So let's running on to this. Let's first go to the code and run it. So I have my repo here. So this is my project, which is a Spring project. I'm going to start it. Run as. You see my Spring server is started. Spring Boot is started. All right. And let's quickly go out here on the POM file to see, hey, what are my dependencies that we have onto the things. So this is the POM file. You can see. So if you look at my POM file, it has all the dependencies that there's a Spring Framework boot, Spring Boot actuator. I'm also having. I'm using the starter web. Starter config for Spring Boot. Everybody knows starter web is required. Spring Boot starter is required for web component. Starter web is needed, and for config starter config is needed, and dev tools is needed, and for testing Spring Boot test. And then I have a configuration processor, and I'm also using a JDBC Spring Boot JDBC, and I'm using MySQL connector. I'm also using Spring Boot starter integration, which is a big framework of Spring on the integration. Am I using file gateway for integration gateway, and then I'm using MongoDB Reactive. So let's look at this one. I am using a Spring Boot starter MongoDB Reactive for building my reactive framework. Okay, so we will go out here and let's quickly go out here. The boot is started, and I will go out here. I have a lab controller. Let's look at this code on this side. So this is a Spring Microservices, again reactive. So I have a plain class, Java class lab controller. I'm annotating with a REST controller that makes this a REST service, and I want to say, hey, all my this lab controller is gonna return me not text XML. Is gonna return me application JS/JSON. So, and I'm gonna have a /sv lab as my route path. Right, that's done with the request mapping, and it's going to produce application here. So there's annotation request mapping done for that, and then I am saying, hey, I want my clients not to get bogged by the course. So course origin star, okay, and for everybody's allowed to make the call. So there's no course. So lab controller, I have a class, and I'm using a logger factory, get logger to this one, and then I'm using a lab repository. Then we have lab controller, and we have a iterable. So let's do the first method. The first method that I want to get the labs right. Okay, so this is a plain iterator. Okay, you see I put it. So what it get labs does is I get a flux. I have a lab repository find all. I get a lab flux, and I get a flux here. This is all is needed to return. You can write a reactive service and return this flux tab, and your work is done. Right, but here I did a little tinkering. I want to convert from reactive RX to non or imperative ones, right? So that's why I say it's easy. If I have a flux and if I'm constrained or somebody tells me to give me a return imperative, you just call toIterator and get you get the imperative ones, and then you can do the while loop, which is very thing. But here is what we get, the flux, the stream, right? And we can do this one. Okay, let's go this one. This method was done to show a demo where conversion of a flux to imperative is very easy, right? But we are interested in flux return. So this is how I'm going to return get labs flux. I have a lab flux one is a get method, and it's a request mapping, and now I get a flux lab. This is all reactive. So Spring is beautiful. I have same controller, except return times is flex mapping. Thanks to Spring, you know, the same Spring framework is now returning the reactive code. Okay, as an API developer. So this is request mapping, labs flux, get method, and I get lab repository find all and labs. Beautiful. Now I want to do get ID method, lab flux ID, request mapping. Remember we had a mono means one component, so we have a mono lab. And this lab is my domain object, and get labs as flux and returns a repository. We have a lab repository out here, so we can go to my components here, right? Repo components here for the lab repository. So I am doing an injection here. So the lab container, I'm injecting lab repository here, a DI, auto-wired, right? DI. So I have a lab repository in the repo folders. If you look at my file also folder, it is clearly saying a lab repository. Let's go to the lab repository files here. This is my model reactive. I have a lab model here, which I'm just putting this lab, a plain Pojo, right, and put a document. Important thing is the document annotation for the lab. I'm using the Mongo, right? Okay, let's go to here, repository document, greetings repository, and reactive. For reactive I created, and this is my lab repository. I'm using Spring framework for the lab repository out here, and let's go out here and build it. Now Surge is running. Let's go and see on our Postman. I am going to this one. You see, I got the lab flux, right? I got list of all this. These are coming from the MongoDB. Let's again do hit it. Again see, send, and I got it. However, if I'm interested in only one component, only one this guy, let's get this one. You see, I got this name, ID, right? So I got the Mongo document here. If I want to list all the documents, I can do that. So this one, let's quickly go in our MongoDB, and we want to see, hey, I want to query my collections, okay? So let's go to our MongoDB bin file. So this is my MongoDB okay. So I have MongoDB. Let me click the correction and we'll just connect quickly here. So I go out here and say, I run the Mongo shell. Okay, Mongo shell is running. Then I can say db is equal to connect. I will use this to minimize the time. I'm making a connect to the local host. I got my DB connection. And I connected to comments database. So I got here show collections here, and for my database, okay, so now let's run this. I got instance of DB. I'm gonna do this. You see, I got my all objects here. I have these 5 objects there in my documents. Every document, this is under ID. This is a Mongo unique ID that Mongo creates, and this is there. And this is about the reactive. Once again, thank you for watching the demo. And this was all about the Spring Reactor. Thanks.